The flame is off, the gas is on for all. Okay, so you're going to be having lower temperature because the gas running longer to maintain the operation. With a higher temperature, so you will be so again, for our application, I don't mind if you really know this, try it. Find out what works.
No, it's not so bad.
It's giving up the heat. That's fertilizing that is a thermodynamic question.
That's what I'm hearing.
I say
It's just a matter of control thing.
That's a free stuff or something.
I'll do it. You're a great to have. How many years? Any day, how many years? Joe did it.
I'll do it.
Something we've taken in from the Church of the Brethren. After church, that nobody leaves for like an hour after church, and everybody stands around and talk. And they're like multiplying it. They stand around and talk before church even starts. So welcome to First Universalist. Yes.
That way we have a warm-up period before that.
Exactly.
And for me, I can sleep.
We know what we're going to discuss. Yes. And discussion is central to everything for the UUs. I think everybody knows that, and we welcome that. And anybody who wants to discuss, feel free to come on a Sunday morning and jump in. Do we have any announcements?
Just a thank you to Chaz and Paula for shoveling our walks and steps and ramps, as well as Mr. Fisherback, our neighbor, also helped in that effort. And then, of course, we contracted the service, but our wonderful people that plowed our lot out, George and company. So it's
in Fisherback. Does he live?
Right next door here.
This guy in the black pickup. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he moved in last year or 2 years ago. 2 years. Yeah, he moved in and renovated that. That was a wreck from my.
Jamie.
What? What Fisherback?
Jamie. He's Mike's son.
Oh, Mike. Okay.
We might even In fact, I'll do that if nobody has any objections. I'll stop and get some donuts or something and just drop them off at his house as thank you for helping out. And that was my experience. I am finally getting old. I was out shoveling my driveway, which if you've seen my house, it goes straight up. So even though we both have four-wheel drive vehicles, you still have to shovel the driveway. You slide out into the road when you come down. My neighbor, who has Parkinson's and can hardly walk, but he does have a snow blower, he came over and blew out the bottom of my driveway for me. So I'm thinking, this is something that I used to do for other people 20 years ago. And you just have to accept when you get to that stage that you have to be genteel and accommodating. If somebody comes and does you a favor, you have to be appreciative. So we are baking him cinnamon rolls, homemade cinnamon rolls, to thank their family for helping. So, okay, church board, the 15th, Mike?
That's correct.
15th, and we'll be discussing pretty much everything. We haven't
We haven't had an opportunity to meet for the last few months, so
Right.
we obviously be doing finances. We will be talking about basically our programming here and the wonderful things that people are doing, contributing to that.
Yes.
And then, of course, as always, what's the future direction of our church? And there won't be any major decisions, but we're going to begin probing that very topic.
And everyone is welcome to come to that, even though it's a church board, and anybody who feels the urge to serve on church board, please volunteer for that. It's an unpaid but very appreciated position. Anybody who is interested, I think we'll have, if possible, have the call-in thing where you could call in.
I'll have to get the phones reprogrammed.
We're going to see if we can do that. We've got the whatever they call that.
Conference phone.
Yeah, it's like a phone that you can speak from a distance. That we've done that before, so if we can set that up, if you have an interest in it.
Conference call.
Conference call, there you go. If anyone has an interest in that and wants to just sit and listen, let us know, and we'll try and get the conference call set up for that. We can't guarantee that, but we'll try.
Actually, they can participate.
And you could actually, if we have it set up, you could actually speak and participate in
I just gotta set it
we
back
would
up.
welcome that. And we don't care whether if you're an interested party, we don't care if you're an official member or just someone who is interested and wants to participate. We would welcome you to become a member if you would like. So, anything else? Okay, our prelude is 403. It's by Roberta, is playing Spirit of Truth, of Life, of Power. And 403 in the hymnal if you want to follow along. Spirit of Truth. And in the Spirit of Truth, Roberta is bringing her information from the New York Times on Sinclair Lewis. He was, you might recognize him as an author, Babbitt, Main Street, pretty famous and pretty well known, kind of disappeared from prominence now. But coincidentally and pretty interestingly, if you see from our introductory slide, he made some predictions in 1935, and this we'll go over some of his works as we go through this, and we'll be talking about Sinclair Lewis next week too. When fascism comes to the United States, it will be wrapped in the American flag and will claim the name of 100% Americanism. He said this in 1935. What do you think?
I think it's pathetic.
We are, you know when they say if you don't pay attention to history and learn from history, you're condemned to relive it? We are going exactly where he was in 1935. We're going exactly back to the same place. So sorry to say. Okay, our chalice lighting, Bold and Courageous Together by Erica Hewitt. Erica is one of my favorite authors from the website, the UU website, where they have all kinds of information that we can use in service. She's always got something good to say. The word courage comes from the Latin cor, which means heart. According to the poet Mark Nepo, the original use of the word courage meant to stand by one's core. A striking concept that reinforces the belief found in almost all traditions that living from the center is what enables us to face whatever life has to offer. To encourage means to hearten, to impart strength and confidence. This is our work as a religious community, to encourage one another, to be bold in engaging the world around us as well as what scares us internally, to give one another the confidence and heart to live as fully as possible. With full hearts, we affirm our relationships with one another. We recognize our agency and our connective power. We accept our responsibility to be bold and courageous. We light this chalice, symbol of all that we are, all that we have done together, and all that we will be as our shared ministry encourages those within and beyond our walls. Our opening hymn is number 12, O Life That Maketh All Things New. Samuel Longfellow, 1819 to 1892, and the music was from 1789. And the words are still the same words we use today, but the inflection, the meaning is always a little bit different. And that's kind of where we're going to go with the children's story as well. From hand to hand, the greeting flows. From eye to eye, the signals run. It's the same sentiment, the same feeling, the same understanding as we have today. All right. We're going to run by that one real quick because I don't want to see that anymore. Sinclair Lewis published a huge amount of stuff, but the first thing he published when he started out, he was an inveterate reader. He read and read and read when he was a kid because he was kind of tall and gangly and not real good at sports or anything else. And he wanted to be a writer from the time he was born. So one of the first things he published was kind of a takeoff. You know how initial writers, they kind of copy an idea or a theme and then embellish it with their own ideas before they actually grow into their full understanding of what their creativity is. At this time in the early 1900s, does anybody know who Tom Swift is? Tom Swift, well, you're going to get an education. Tom Swift is a story, where's my... Well, first of all, let me start you out with, anybody heard of a Tom Swiftie? Oh, you guys have lived in the dark ages. All right, listen to this. I'm no good at darts, said Tom aimlessly. I pitch softball, said Tom underhandedly. The milk isn't fresh, said Tom sourly. Mush, said Tom huskily. And I'll let you finish this one. Where are my crutches? Asked Tom. Where are my crutches? Asked Tom. Lamely. So these are Tom Swifties. When you use an adverb to describe the first phrase, the first clause, and there are hundreds of these, and that's where they came from. And I don't know where, they didn't come from the book. The book is by a guy named Victor Appleton. Well, let me go ahead and go through this. Hike and the Aeroplane by Tom Graham was the first published book by Sinclair Lewis and was a derivation of Tom Swift. Tom Swift was enormously popular starting in 1910 when evidently science was a big thing. Popular among the general culture and especially young men, not great literature, just fun to read. As I can attest, at age 9 or 10, visiting my grandmother in Danville, Illinois, on a bookshelf on the stairway landing in a big old Victorian two-story were a line of teen literature my Uncle Spud, his given name was Carroll, which is probably why he went by Spud, had read as a child. These are some of the actual books that I brought back when I was 9 years old or 10 years old from Danville, Illinois, back to Indiana. This is Tom Swift and his motorcycle. This was the first book that he published, that the Tom Swift, the Appleton people published. And in the same series is a book called, how many have heard of Horatio Alger? Okay, I will explain Horatio Alger a little bit more too. It's part of American culture. There were three main styles of writing at this time for teen kids, for boys. Tom Swift, boy inventor. Horatio Alger, poor boy makes good by dint of hard work and honesty, and the flowering of the Protestant capitalist mythology still in evidence today. In conservative circles, all you need to succeed is pluck and opportunity. If you're poor, it's your own fault. And the third one is the boy detective. How many have heard the Hardy Boys? The Hardy Boys are a little bit later, but that's the same. This is teenage literature, books written for teens. Victor Appleton was the nominative author of the Tom Swift books, but Victor Appleton was merely a name. What happened was they just hired out ghostwriters to churn these things out. They're not great literature. They follow a pattern all the way through, but they're fun to read. When I got them out last night to bring to here, I started reading them and I couldn't stop. So even now, they're still fun to read. Let's see, or much later, the Nancy Drew mysteries. Now, they did include women, but that was a long time later. This was a time of immense confidence in American spirit called the Manifest Destiny, or secretly, kind of sub rosa, the white man's burden. All this confidence was traced to the American individual's ability to overcome any obstacle. Of course, this predates the First World War and the worldwide depression that followed in the late 20s. That shifted reliance toward big government again. Find the parallel in our times. Everybody is saying, only individuals can succeed, get the government out of everything, the government's the cause of all your problems. We know that's not the truth. Back to Tom Swift. A young man with bounding enthusiasm and creativity, he started by adapting and improving existing inventions like the motorcycle, his first book. In that book, he bought a motorcycle who a rich man had been riding down the street, and this is 1935, 1920, this is actually 1910, 1915, when motorcycles were just coming out. They were basically bicycles with a rude motor strapped onto them. So not only did you have to be a mechanic to keep them going, they weren't real refined in their operation. So this rich guy bought one, kept falling off of it and couldn't ride it. So Tom Swift, the inventor, bought it from him for $50, which was a lot of money in those days, and refined it and made it the more modern motorcycle. Okay, he soon advanced to actually predicting inventions before their time. One of his inventions was the phototelephone. Any idea what that became years later?
Fax.
The fax machine. These people, this is the original science fiction. They created these ideas in their head that they knew sometime would be able to be done, but had no concept of how to do it then. But they created the idea of the fax machine. Or a giant magnet to rescue submarines. Or a house on wheels, which became
Mobile homes.
the mobile home, the motor home. And this was way before they had motorhomes, or even the idea of motorhomes. Interestingly, Tom Swift and his electric rifle, and that is TSER, Tom Swift and his electric rifle became what?
Taser.
The guy who invented the taser, and the reason he named it taser, and why did he put the A in? Because you can't pronounce TSER, so he threw A in. The taser is actually the guy that invented that had read Tom Swift and his electric rifle when he was a kid. And who knows whether that stimulated his idea, but he invented the taser. So that's where that came from. And that was his name. Jack Cover was the guy who invented that. And also inspired was Steve Wozniak. Anybody know who he is? He was the co-founder of Apple Computer. He was a big reader of Tom Swift when he was a kid. As a torchbearer for culture, there are also some not so endearing qualities, like the position of women in boys' life. And you can imagine many of you were Boy Scouts, and back, even in the 50s and 60s, how women were treated. In these books, they're treated even more condescendingly. And probably the worst thing, which was completely accepted in those days, and which we are shocked by today, Tom's assistant was a black gentleman who was called a darky and was treated as a darky. He was not a slave, but he was treated as kind of an under creature. And this was in a book meant to be good feeling and everybody likes everybody and the positive things about America. So American history needs to be taught as American history really is, not whitewashed. So where do we assign the value of children's books? Do they reflect the culture they were written out of, or do they shape the culture they were injected into? And I've got a couple pictures here. This is Tom Swift and his giant robot. That's a later one. And this is Tom Swift and his electric rifle, which I just told you about. This is the motorcycle. This is what they looked like in the early days of riding motorcycles. Basically a bicycle. And we go back to Sinclair Lewis, so we'll go back to... Okay, so do these books, children's books, do they reflect the culture? In other words, the writers, are they just reflecting what they've already grown up with and just regurgitating it? Or are they actually shaping the culture as they write and describe these conditions, and young boys read this, or young girls, and then they emulate this activity? Maybe it's a little bit of both. Kind of like Fox News reflects the mentality of its viewers by showing them what they want to see, but it also reinforces that misanthropic vision. So today we see parent groups trying and succeeding in removing controversial books from school libraries, books on race, books on sexual identity, books on historical embarrassments, such as Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Are you aware of the controversy considering Mouse? Does anybody know what Mouse is?
Isn't
Mouse.
this a new thing we're hearing about?
It's a new thing we're hearing about, but it was written years and years ago. And Art Spiegelman is a kind of a forward-thinking, you would almost say avant-garde artist. It's actually a comic book, but they don't call them comic books anymore. What do they call them? Graphic art?
Yeah.
And it's a big book. It's not a comic book size, it's a big book. But in it, I should have put the picture in. I'll bring the picture next week. In it, he talks about the Holocaust. Art Spiegelman is obviously Jewish, talks about the Holocaust, where the victims, the Jewish people, are mice, and the Nazis are all cats. And he goes through the actual depiction of the Holocaust with some pretty disturbing figures in it, some pretty disturbing panels. You know how graphic novels are, they do pretty much everything. If you've watched any of the graphic movies on TV now, they've been taken, Batman, Superman, the Black Panther, all those were taken from comic books. They have some pretty graphic depictions of real life in there, and in Tennessee, they just got it banned from the libraries in Tennessee, the parents group did, because it was too graphic for kids. This is one of those things where they're trying to stop education about the world, what the world is really like, to protect kids, when actually what they're doing is creating a situation where it can be recreated again. Okay, a comic book depicting the horrors of concentration camp genocide on an entire group of people. Here we can take a minute to discuss, what is race? How many of you heard about the controversy with Whoopi Goldberg? Whoopi Goldberg of The View said the Holocaust was whites killing whites, and got in trouble for it because she was saying you're using it as racism, when racism is when black or Asian or Indians or any other race are put upon by the dominant race. Whereas the Jews are basically white. If you had 5 Jews and 5 Germans and 5 Irish all standing in a row, you'd be hard put to tell who was what. But most people would say that Jews are white, but the Nazis labeled them the Jewish race, a convenient shortcut which made it easier to label, discriminate, and hate. They were not your neighbors, they're not your cousins, they're not your fellow citizens, they were of another race. But while we say blacks and Asians are another race, easily identifiable by their appearance, science does not recognize race. You can't find scientists or any scientific theory that says Asians and Americans or Asians and Germans or Indians like East Indians, they're not a different race. They're just because of the environment they grew up in, they have different appearance. But that's race is a construct created by people to, it's what they call stereotyping. It makes you so you can make decisions quickly. When you see somebody, you can make a decision about what's going to happen in the future. You can predict what your actions are going to be. It's a learning experience that comes with people naturally. That's how you speed up things. Instead of doing a repetitive task over and over and over again, you have an automatic response to it. If you put your hand close to a warm stove, you pull it back. You already know that. If you see the stove little lights on that says the burner's hot, you don't have to put your hand on there and burn it. You know it's hot. It's the same thing with race. If you're driving through downtown Dayton and you see black people in hoodies, a lot of them clustered on a corner, you know that the odds are you're going to be in trouble if you stop there and ask them for directions. Whereas if you're out in Greenville and you see 4 or 5 white people standing on a corner talking, you have no hesitancy about stopping and asking them for directions, because you're assuming that those people will be friendly to you where the people in Dayton will be unfriendly to you. That's the human mind jumping those hurdles and making the shortcuts. But sometimes, obviously, the shortcuts are wrong, and sometimes they're actually right. My wife chides me all the time because I say we need to look at this honestly. There are, when you see some black guy following you down the street, it's scary. I mean, you don't know for sure what it is. And she says, I'm being a racist. When we drive down 70 and turn off on Salem Avenue, what does she do?
Locks the door.
She locks the doors on the car. That's not racist. That's not stupid. That's smart, because there's high crime in the Salem Avenue neighborhood. Not all of it is done by black people, but a large part of it is. So, too bad Ty isn't here. We want to talk about what's legitimate lumping of people together for their problems, and we'll go into that in the future farther. Are we causing the problems in the inner city communities Remember we talked about what the Gallianus, the protozoa that gets into the turds and contaminates people, and it causes them to have mental problems. Are we causing the problems in the inner city to cause crime to happen? Or is that something that's a cultural thing? I don't have the answer to that, but it's something we need to discuss and be able to discuss with other people. Okay, so we know how much science is ignored in this age, and back in the time of Tom Swift, when every teen wanted to be an inventor and everyone knew science would save the US of America. That was when science was held up in prominence and everybody wanted to be a scientist. If only we could go back to that time again. So let me end with, I never did trust that buzzsaw, said Tom offhandedly. Okay, that's our children's story. Any comments on that? All right, our affirmation. Blessed are we by Andrea Hawkins Kemper. Blessed are we who gather with open hearts together in this space today. Blessed are we, the chalice lighters of resistance, justice, love, and faith. Blessed are we, the heretics, the outcasts, the walkers of our own way. Blessed are we, the border crossers, the refugees, the immigrants, the poor, the wanderers who are not lost. Blessed are we, the transgressors, the trespassers, the bypassers, the cause takers, the defiant, the compliant. Blessed are we, the hand extenders, the sign makers, the protesters, the protectors. Blessed are we, trans women, trans men, the non-binary, the cisgender, the multigender, and the no-gender. Blessed are we, the friend, the stranger, the lonely, the hidden, the visible, and the authentic. Blessed are we who rise in solidarity. Blessed are we who cannot. Blessed are we who do not. Blessed are we, for this is our beloved community. This is who we are. Joys and concerns. Now let's go back. Joys and concerns. Let me bring up Canada. Anybody been following the news? 8 days this has been going on. The streets of Ottawa are still packed with trucks and people protesting that the fact that they have, if they come from the United States, they have to be vaccinated. Truck drivers have to be vaccinated. Talk about the refusal, the antagonism towards science. And this is the scariest thing. I think I mentioned this last week. This infection has now reached Canada, the country known for being polite, nice people who would never cause trouble. I will bring the picture next week if I can think of it. Nazi flags being paraded down the street, Confederate flags being paraded down the street. I don't know whether Americans are going up to Canada to do this, or these are Canadians who want to be Americans, or they've been in Florida too long. I don't have any idea, but it is totally unlike the Canadian behavior that anybody's been told about. Now these people are talking about maintaining the shutdown of the main streets of Ottawa, spreading it to Montreal and other major cities, Calgary, until the government rescinds this order that people have to be vaccinated. This sounds to me like maybe it's a Canadian version of an insurrection. They're not actually breaking windows and killing people, but they're certainly trying to take over the government, which is trying to follow the scientific principles and being castigated for doing it. Yes?
I think that goes right along, very much connected to, we reached a significant milestone a few days ago. That number is 900,000. 900,000 people who have died with links, causes, all probability to COVID. It seems like a few months back, we were all amazed that we reached the 500,000 mark.
Yep.
900,000.
And nothing has changed. Florida is still trying to, and back Virginia, the new governor of Virginia put out the executive order that schools cannot mandate masks to be worn in schools. And they've done scientific studies, masks do help. We talked about this before, and I want to encourage you to get the N5 masks, the super thin, or the super, basically they're ventilating masks that protect you from aerosols. The actual cloth mask will help, and that protects from droplets, but the aerosols, you need to have the N95, the mask that has the finer web. That's what you would use if you can buy them in any hardware store. If you're painting, there's mold, fumes, anything like that, the N95 will help protect you. And yet these people are mandating rules against that. They're actually killing their own people, which is another sign of some kind of insanity. 95% of the people dying from COVID are unvaccinated. So they're killing their own constituents, and their own constituents are basically committing suicide. That tells me something is radically wrong with our civilization. Okay, the second thing I have is the Ukraine. 100,000 Russian forces on the north and, well, actually on three sides, north, east, and the southern border, where they've already taken Crimea. We're still kind of playing this cat and mouse thing. Are they going to invade? Are they not going to invade? What are they going to do if they do invade? We are sending more troops to Eastern Europe. This is not a good time for anybody. And people are pushing the buttons, they're acting more and more irrationally in an age where we should be becoming more rational. And of course, let me go down to my final one is always, and particularly what we're discussing this week, the state of the nation. Sinclair Lewis tried to warn us. He wrote a play called It Can't Happen Here, and that was about what the Nazi takeover in Germany and how scary it was that it might. On the right is the picture of the January 6th insurrection. You can see the American flag a little bit different, the Trump flags, the Don't Tread on Me flags, and these are being called by the Republican National Committee, the actual United States Republican Party is calling this a peaceful protest, and that legitimate protest by citizens should not be prosecuted. So the whole party is standing up for this. 5 people, I think 5 or maybe 6 people died as a result of that. Windows were broken, excrement was smeared through the Capitol, things were stolen off of senators and legislators' desks. This is not a peaceful protest as the United States understands peaceful protest. All right, let me light a bunch of candles. Anything else? So in conclusion, for those who sometimes attend and aren't here, we hope you're safe, and we hope you are watching today, and hope you can come back tomorrow. Hope you can come and attend our meeting, the 15th, our board meeting. We need your input. We need everybody's input. And for those thoughts and prayers, those fears that you hold inside, we are there with you. We want to help you if we can. Just know that our moral support is behind you. Okay, our offering. We're going to hear Yigdal is a Jewish hymn.
Fish Sunday also.
Oh, this is Fish Sunday, yes. So don't forget Fish Sunday. And I think our other tray is out here.
Yeah, it's down.
Yeah, it's down there. All right. As is usual, feel free to put something in. If you need something, take something out. You can contribute online. You can slip an envelope under the door. Still waiting to see that. That would be a miracle. Or if you need something, let us know. We'd be glad to help you. one of the things we say every week, but we really mean it. Let songs of hope and faith arise. And we'd love to hear the songs if we had people that could do them. So, all right, Sinclair Lewis by Roberta. Let me change your slide so you got an appropriate slide.
That's the same picture as I was going to show you.
Yes, I read that. Anybody that wants to, the article is in the New York Times.
New York
It's
Times.
available online because I am not subscribed to it. So,
Okay. On Main Street. This is the 100th year of Babbitt, the book. It was Sinclair Lewis's best and most misunderstood novel. He had written 5 inconsequential books that had received respectable, if not excited attention. And in 1920, at the age of 35, he had written Main Street, the most sensationally successful novel of the century to date. Hundreds of thousands of copies were sold, and a title that came to stand for the values, both narrow-minded and wholesome, of what we now call Middle America, and that would be us. The Pulitzer Prize jury chose it as the year's best novel, but in a scandalous reversal of their decision, the prize's trustees refused to approve the award and presented it instead to Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence. A few years later, when the judges chose Lewis's Aerosmith, he refused to accept the prize. Sinclair Lewis had a thin skin, and he didn't forget that he was turned down before. Nothing ever changes. When in 1974, the jury unanimously chose Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, the prize's overseers again refused to certify the decision, using words like turgid, obscene, bombastic in their publication. At the time of their publication, both Main Street and Babbitt were generally thought of as satirical novels, America being the object of the satire. Both Main Street's Gopher Prairie, which is the small town in Sioux Center, Minnesota, where Lewis grew up, and Zenith, the medium-sized city where Babbitt conducts his prosperous realty business. Yes, Babbitt had a realty business. And meticulously and convincingly anatomized, Lewis always got the details right on these small towns. The tremendous success of Main Street and the strong reaction to it by both its champions and its detractors suggest how close to the bone its truth struck. It was easier to dismiss it or to enjoy it as elitist, anti-American satire than to accept it as a disturbing vision of the realities of home. Lewis himself was clear about his feelings for Gopher Prairie, which he called the town Sioux Center. He called it Gopher Prairie. He recognized the town, he deplored the town, and he loved it. And doesn't that sound familiar with people we know in our towns? Now, where am I? Okay. Sinclair Lewis was born in 1885. His father was a prominent doctor in Sioux Center, a town of about 2,800. You can read all about it in Main Street. Fred, the oldest of the doctor's 3 sons, became a miller and was never of much consequence within the ambitious Lewis clan. Claude, the next oldest, was of considerable consequence. He became a distinguished surgeon. He was admired and sought after well beyond the city of St. Cloud, where he spent his adult life. When Lewis was 62, he acknowledged that for 60 years, I have tried to impress my brother Claude. Sinclair Lewis was never really known as Sinclair, his middle name. He was Harry, later Hal, then he was Red. Eventually he was called Red to everyone who knew him. Now remember all those names. He goes by Sinclair, he goes by Lewis, he goes by Harry, Hal, and Red. And the people who were really familiar with him, I think, referred to him as Red. He was not a physically prepossessing young fellow. He was nearly 6 feet tall before he was 16 years old. He had a short torso set on very long and spindly legs. He weighed only 120 pounds. He was lank and lean, with a puffy, acne-ridden face. He had big feet and hands, badly coordinated in his movements. Everything, his body hanging and dangling and swinging and hanging and stumbling, and ice blue eyes rather protruding. All of this with thatched red, carrot-colored hair, hence the name Red. Nor did he have the happy, normal, outdoorsy boyhood, skating, swimming, duck hunting. He claimed to have had a happy boyhood doing all those things, but he was a boy with only one real friend in a town full of boys. He was laughed at by girls. Sports? Oh no. Dances? As I could not dance, I just went along with Ma to look on. But a lot of culture passed through town. There were military bands, the Ski U Ma Quartet, whatever that was, the Maharajas minstrels, the Schubert Symphony. Now tell me, do we pronounce it Schubert or Schubert? I never know.
Schubert.
What?
Schubert.
Schubert?
Yes.
I never know. I don't know what I did there. Okay, the Casgrove Company performed with musical glasses, sleigh bells, mandolins, and banjos, and itinerant theatrical events from Uncle Tom's Cabin to the Jolly Della Pringle Company. Those were all the entertainment in Sioux Center. Most important, actually crucial, there were books. Sinclair's father had a modest library, and young Harry began acquiring books on his own. His favorite writers as a boy were Dickens, Scott, and Kipling, and he went on reading them throughout his lifetime. For years, he was a rotten student. Until late in high school, he began to shine. He was a notorious cut-up, a mimic, and the proud author of class yells, such as Kumalaka, Boomalaka, Bow Wow Wow, Chingalaka, Chingalaka, Chow Chow Chow. Now he was well thought of for his class yells. He had crushes on one girl after another, sometimes two at the same time. He did domestic chores, he had summer jobs, and he submitted flowery poems to various magazines. All, of course, were rejected. They didn't like his flowery poems. But he was also getting ready for college, having decided to try for Yale after spending some time at Oberlin. To sharpen his skills, he was admitted to Yale after spending time at Oberlin. His career in New Haven was checkered. His only distinction was being published regularly in the Yale Library magazine. He wrote romantic stories and flowery poems. Girls, gauche attempts. Friends, just a few. Intimacies? Hardly. The esteemed educator William Lyons Phelps said of him, he was not disliked in college, he was regarded with amiable tolerance as a freak. Poor Sinclair. His emotional state, as always, loneliness. Yet he was adventuresome. One summer, he worked as a cattle feeder on a cattle steamer in England. One fall, steerage passage to Panama in search of work there. Then a few wander years. A well-known artist community in Carmel. A short stretch on a San Francisco newspaper. Upton Sinclair's utopian colony in New Jersey. Finally, New York, where he lived in Greenwich Village and found sympathetic companions like Edna Ferber and Frances Perkins, who would go on to become FDR's famous Secretary of Labor. He was earning a few dollars by selling scraps of things to junky magazines and newspapers. And he was selling plots for stories to established writers. Jack London, for one, who is in one transaction, paid him $70 for 14 story ideas. And he had begun work on his first novel, Our Mr. Wren. That's W-R-E-N-N. I had never heard of that book. Am I doing that?
Yes, you're pushing on the computer.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought, am I doing that? No. Okay, anyway, Sinclair Lewis had begun work on his first novel, which was Our Mr. Wren, W-R-E-N-N. He was also edging his way into the publishing world, working most effectively for George Duran, who wrote about him. Lewis pounded on a typewriter the crispest of American staccato opinion and criticism. Literally reams of publicity stunts. He was a dynamo of energy and freshness of thought. In 1912, he was working for a publisher whose offices were on 4th Avenue in the same building where Vogue had its offices. That's Vogue as in fashion. Late one evening, he was coming downstairs in the freight elevator when in stepped a very pretty young woman who had also been working late. In his typical clumsy way, he managed to bump into her, scattering to the ground the work she was taking home with her. Her name was Grace Livingston Hager, and she was the junior editor and writer at Vogue. She was elegantly dressed with a kind of fancy accent that presumably came from her British parents and the time she had spent in Europe while growing up. Lewis fell madly in love. He wooed her ferociously with letters, notes, poems, jokes, the dedication to the book, Our Mr. Wren. He dedicated that book to this young woman he had just met. Let's see, he took her on expeditions, including a picnic on the Palisades, to which he brought lamb chops and canned peas that he cooked on a portable stove. Eventually, Gracie, as he called her, succumbed to his unrelenting pressure, and they were married in 1914. He was 29, she was 26. She worked hard to sophisticate him, getting him out of his hideous cheap blue suits and respectable tweeds, which he wore. She refined his Midwestern accent. For a few years, they had fun together, roaming around the country in a Model T Ford, settling down in one place, then rushing off to another, and then the fun stopped. But during these years, Lewis's career as a writer was advancing. More financially rewarding than the 5 early novels were the short stories he was churning out. Conventional fare snapped up by commercial magazines, at least 20 of them by the popular and well-paying Saturday Evening Post. We know a lot about the Lewis marriage because Gracie would write 2 books about it and him. One a novel, the other a memoir. Both books are fond, outspoken, and convincing. They're convincing about him as a father. They had one boy, Wells, who was named after Lewis's hero, H.G. Wells. When she gave birth, Hal was infinitely tender toward me, but his care for me the care was for me. The baby seemed not to even exist for him. Of Lewis's early novels, The Job is the best. A persuasive account of how a poor but determined young woman prevails in the commercial real estate business. A book marred only by a preposterous romantic ending. Now, Lewis sensed, was the moment for him to focus on Main Street, the novel about small-town America that he had been considering and planning for years. And it, too, would be centered as a young woman. The subtitle was The Story of Carol Kennicott. She's a smart young professional librarian who's brought to Gopher Prairie by her young doctor husband. At first, she's certain that she can help change things for the better, ameliorate the crudeness, the small-mindedness, the lack of culture, lack of beauty. When her efforts are defeated by the kind but impervious local citizenry, she leaves husband in town to find satisfying work and a finer way of life in, guess where? New York City, of course. Yes, this is a feminist story, but one with an inconclusive resolution. Soon enough, she's back to husband in Gopher Prairie, mortified, but with a growing appreciation of the decency of its people and the wholesomeness of its life. And despite the humiliating setback, Carol plows on, more tactfully than before perhaps, but indefatigable. Was she meant to be taken as a high-minded emissary of enlightenment? Or was she as much an object of Lewis's satire as Main Street itself? A century has gone by, and we're sure not sure. Main Street, which was published late in 1920, exploded on the consciousness of America. There had never been anything like it. Its instant and sustained literary and commercial success. Within months, that book had rocketed past 150,000 books. Eventually, it would sell in the millions. With praise for such sources as Britain's leading novelist, John Galsworthy, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote to Lewis, I want to tell you that Main Street has displaced Theronware in my favor as the best American novel. Main Street, the book, was an event, a phenomenon, a triumph abroad as well. Sinclair Lewis had truly arrived. In the 1920s, he published not only Main Street and Babbitt, but 3 other novels that won comparable acclaim. Aerosmith, about an idealistic young doctor scientist. Elmer Gantry, remember Elmer Gantry, the movie? I did not read the book, but I made sure I saw that movie. And that was, when was Elmer Gantry? It was a 1960 movie from the 1927 novel. Okay, let's see. Okay, he wrote Elmer Gantry, a scathing satirical event of evangelism and religion in America. It was the top fiction bestseller of 1927. And he wrote Dodsworth, about a retired American businessman searching abroad for what he senses he's missed out on his life. His best written and most affecting book, and later, the basis of William Wyler's brilliant film. The maddening Mrs. Dodsworth owes much to Gracie, whom he was more or less amicably divorcing. And then in 1930, the moment of his career, he became the first American to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. But he understood the implications. This is the end of me, his friend Lillian Gish reports him saying. This is fatal. I cannot live up to it. That's the end until next week, and then we'll hear more about Sinclair Lewis if you wish.
Much more to tell.
Pardon me?
Much more to tell.
Much more to tell.
And we wish.
One interesting thing that you mentioned about Sauk Center, the entertainments that came along. Of course, this is in the early 1900s when they didn't have movies, they didn't have radios, anything was that public. So people got their entertainment from speakers that came around, chautauquas, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
They mentioned two of the things that came through were, one, minstrel shows, and two, the production of Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah.
If you're aware of what minstrel shows are, those are the two most opposite possible things that you could have. Minstrel shows make fun of the quote-unquote darkies. It's when blackface came about and they do the singing and dancing, and it was always white people that put blackface on and then pretended to be black people.
I was one of those.
You were.
When I went to Gettysburg High School, Gettysburg, of course, here, we did a minstrel show. And I really didn't know what minstrel shows were, but I learned.
All I can say is don't run for public office.
There'll be a picture.
There'll be a picture of you somewhere.
Yeah, right.
And the same people who participated in it will drag that picture out and condemn you for it.
Oh, yes.
The hypocrites will rise up out of the ground and storm the Bastille. So.
Yeah.
And yet they did Uncle Tom's Cabin. So this was his take on Main Street. This was where that woman went to New York and then came back.
Yeah.
There is fantastic good, fantastic generosity, fantastic sharing of neighborliness in Greenville, and there is the depth of depravity and isolation and condemnation and segregation, racism. Those two things exist side by side.
So Roberta, next week we find out what fueled his phenomenal interest in productivity in the area of satire. Was he politically influenced, or will we find that out next week?
Well, I hope so. I don't know what you'll find out. I have made a note here, which maybe will fit into next week better, but I've made a note that Burt Lancaster won an Oscar for his 2.5 hours portraying Elmer Gantry as a flawed preacher. It was a 1960 movie from the 1927 novel. And I couldn't wait to see that movie, which I did. I had a babysitter for my children, so I could go see Elmer Gantry. And it was a very lengthy thing. But Burt Lancaster playing a preacher was very good. And he had been kicked out of seminary school. So what he knew as being a preacher was what he learned before he was kicked out of seminary. So... anything else?
And that's, once again, is a prediction of what's happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s. The preachers who are phenomenally successful on TV and make millions of dollars have their own private jets, their luxury homes, their air-conditioned dog houses, and basically preach prosperity or give money to me and you'll get rich from God. I mean, he predicted all this in the 20s that this was going to happen.
You know, did he predict that you could get a blister pack of miracle water from Reverend Papa?
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that?
No.
What are you talking about?
Okay, he wasn't all that good, so that's what I'm saying. No, I'll tell you later. Well, you can send for a blister pack of miracle water from the Reverend Papa.
Papa.
P-O-P-O-V, I think it is. I don't think that's his real name. You know about this guy?
We don't watch TV at 2 in the morning.
I leave it there.
Okay.
We'll finish off next week about Sinclair.
I'm considering. Ooh, what happened here?
Oh, Tim, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I don't know where we are.
It's like sailing on the ocean.
Yes. You must have had your thumb on the L or something because it was covered with.
I'll stay away from that next week.
Well, I'll just move the
Just close
computer.
it next
Usually I
time.
move it when Derek's here. See, I don't know how you did that because that should have been a completed slide that you shouldn't have been able to add to. That's interesting. So, let's see. Oh, next week for the children's stories, would you like to hear a synopsis maybe of some of his more famous books? I haven't really picked a children's story yet. And I picked Tom Swift because that was a favorite of mine and it was connected to him. So we'll go through, and that's not in, I don't think the movies are not very well described in the New York Times article. So we'll give you a kind of a background of what that's about. All right, closing hymn is number 6. Just as long as I have breath. Just as long as I have breath. That could well be the UU mantra. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to life. Tell them I said yes to truth. Tell them I said yes to love. Very good. Okay, closing words. Teachers Everywhere by Amy Zucker Morgenstern. In every person we meet, especially those who cause us discomfort, we find an opportunity for us to grow, to learn, to go further along the path of transformation that is our purpose in life. Every single one is a teacher. May the next week bring you many such moments of meeting that help you become the person you want to be, and may you welcome them with joy. I did find more donuts or more snacks at Kroger, but it was a really fancy 6-pack. So there's a knife back there. If everybody's going to get a piece, we're going to have to cut them in half. And I don't know if I turned the hot water on yet, but it won't take long to make coffee. Our postlude is Ain't She Sweet? Valentine's Day is coming up.
I think Sinclair Lewis probably danced to this.
Lewis did not dance to it because he couldn't dance, but I'll bet Tom Swift did. He watched with his
It was
mother.
vaudeville.
He watched with his mother, but I'll bet Tom Swift danced to it all over the place. So. All right, have a good week. Wear your mask. The crest, I think, is crossed, but the epidemic is still just going everywhere in Dark County. I got more and more people that I peripherally know that are being positive for COVID virus. So wear your masks. If anybody wants to look at the Horatio Alger or Tom Swift and his motorcycle, is more than welcome to do that.